In fantasy football, just like many other factors in life, you don't want to burn yourself, right? You're not going to touch the hot stove. And if you do, you learn from it. You're not going to do it again. You don't want to burn yourself. You don't want to fall for the booby traps. And maybe they don't seem obvious at first, but once you get through it with a little bit more experience, you can call it out right there. I see you. I'm not falling for this, right? I'm not getting burnt again. Now in fantasy football, you can get burnt. You can get burnt by certain positions, taking guys too early, drafting potential busts, guys that are screaming out, overhyped, fantastic player, great offense, but not the exact usage potentially, right? Not the exact role that makes him a great fantasy player. Can be the best real life player, great role player for a team, but they don't get enough usage in fantasy and people want to play the if game. Well, once too many ifs starts to roll, now you need 20 things to happen. You need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things to happen just for this to work out for you. The whole goal of fantasy, right, is to hit on upside with as little ifs as possible. Bake in a great floor. Bake in stability with upside to that stability. How can you project this situation works out with as little ifs as possible? Not 5, 6 ifs. Not if this guy gets hurt and this quarterback gets hurt, and if the offensive line takes a bump up, and if the defense gets worse, they'll throw more. We can't have all of these, right? We can't. And that's what's happening with this player today, that you should stay away from this player. Stay away from this running back in fantasy 2021. He's a player that has too many ifs. He's a player that is fantastic talent-wise, and if you're paying attention closely, he led the league last year in yards per carry with almost 6 yards per carry. Number 1 in the NFL. That's great. He was extremely efficient. He was number 3 in yards created per touch, meaning he was doing stuff on his own behind a solid offensive line that has likely gotten worse, losing some players on that line. Now, maybe you're picking up on some of this trail I'm leading to this player, but he's in a backfield where they just gave some guaranteed money to not the backup. No, don't take this as a backup running back in the backfield. It's a role player that is going to have a very strong role, if not close to a 50-50 role in this backfield. And oh yeah, he probably has the number 1 rushing quarterback, at least over the last 2 years, in attempts per game and overall yardage in Lamar Jackson. So we should have given it away by now. I think you should stay away from, must avoid is like a strong term, but still, same context, stay away from J.K. Dobbins this year in your fantasy drafts. And he's going around, depending on which site you're drafting, on RB20 range, right around there. It's something that I'm not personally touching. He's my RB24. And right now, on average, if you just look at Underdog Fantasy, which is the best ADP out there right now, in my opinion, you could draft an Underdog if you want to. If you use the code SAL, anytime you play over there and you deposit money for your first time, bang, they'll give you $25. Even if you deposit $5, you get $25 to play with. Pretty damn good deal. Make money right there on Underdog, which you can try and parlay into $1 million rooskies, $1,001,000 rooskies to be exact. Pretty damn cool. But he's going on Underdog as of this recording as the running back 17. My RB24, I'm never going to get J.K. Dobbins. Now, I'm not saying he's the worst running back ever. He's still a top 25 borderline RB2 for me. But I think people are expecting him to be this RB1 and definitely locked in as an RB2. Based on my ranking of RB24, I think he's barely hanging on to an RB2 role. And I think we should kind of break down why here. Now, what was expected last year when J.K. Dobbins was drafted to this team? Well, this is looking like a fantastic role. Right away, people start to look at the contracts in this backfield. Well, they have this rookie out of Rutgers, Gus Edwards, who's on the team, right? He played one nice season with them, so he's on the team there. And then there's Mark Ingram. So there's no capital in Gus Edwards, right? That's what people are telling themselves. And Mark Ingram has an out after this upcoming season. That's exactly what happens. Mark Ingram is no longer on the team. He started to not play all that much, if at all, towards the end of the season last year. So the perception when J.K. Dobbins was drafted last year by the Baltimore Ravens was dynasty fantasy football. This is a great spot for him. And potentially as soon as year 2, he can be a top 10 running back where the Cam Akers and Jonathan Taylor conversation, Antonio Gibson to a lesser extent, is going for 2021 fantasy football. What is the actuality? Well, Mark Ingram ended up leaving. J.K. Dobbins had a fine first year, especially for a rookie commanding close to 40% of the overall snaps. Is good for a rookie running back in a crowded backfield with Lamar Jackson. But one thing was not taken into account, into that whole equation, and that man's name is Gus Edwards. Sure, an undrafted free agent who had over 5 yards per touch, top 3 in the NFL his rookie year, and over 700 yards. That wasn't taken into account. And that repeating as an undrafted free agent was not really taken into account to happen last year. But it did. He had over 700 yards and yet again averaged over 5 yards per carry. Now he's one of 2 running backs ever ever. Gus Edwards, an undrafted free agent out of Rutgers, which for college football has been the laughing stock for the past 5 to 10 years. The second running back ever in his first 2 seasons to average over 5 yards per clip, right? Being in an efficient offense helps that, but doing it on your own as well is pretty damn cool, over 700 yards. The only other one, Nick Chubb. And we know how damn good and potentially the best pure runner in football Nick Chubb is. So what happens after last year? Well, they give a second round tenure on Gus Edwards, which means 2 things can happen here. You either have to pay him for this specific year $3.3 million or 110%, a 10% bonus of what he ended up making last year, whichever one is greater. And for Gus Edwards, they would have had to pay him $3.3 million. So that's a lot of money. It's not backup running back money. So what do? They just extended him. They recently extended him this summer, 2 years, for $10 million. So now the average salary is $5 million instead of the 1-year deal being 3.3. They can move some things around in the books. Basically, they're doing a 2-year commitment at $5 million. That is not backup running back salary. That is about 40% to 45% of the workload, if not more, salary. And that is exactly what Gus Edwards was trending towards last year, playing about 35% of the snaps and seeing 37% of the opportunities, had over 700 yards, 6 touchdowns. He saw 9.9 opportunities per game. The other thing is Gus Edwards, and yes, Dobbins was a rookie early on, not being immediately in there like Gus Edwards was after proving himself as a rookie, even being undrafted. Gus Edwards saw more red zone usage. He saw more goal line usage. Even down the stretch, Gus Edwards was as involved or more involved than J.K. Dobbins when Mark Ingram started to not play as much or not play at all. Now, outside of Gus Edwards being in this backfield and people just underweighting that as a pure backup role, not thinking that he's going to see this much usage as he's been one of the most productive backs in his first 2 years ever in the NFL as a pure ground rusher. Yes, it sounds crazy to say that, but that's why he's being underrated himself, and J.K. Dobbins is kind of being overrated, in my opinion, inflated right now. The other thing is J.K. Dobbins doesn't really have a passing role. Like, he was fine at Ohio State, not great in the receiving game. He had 71 receptions in his 3 seasons there, which sounds like a lot, but they got extra games because of their playoff bids that they had, their postseason, their Big Ten championship. So we got a couple extra games in there. So on a per game basis, it wasn't anything crazy. Like J.K. Dobbins catching 2 balls in a game for Ohio State was an outlier performance almost. And he wasn't used at all last year. Now, this is not an offense that really throws to the running back because you have a mobile quarterback who's had 1,000 yards each of the past 2 seasons, averaging over 10.5 attempts, Lamar Jackson, over each of the past 2 seasons. So you're not going to check it down to the running back all that much. He only ran 12 routes per game last year. He only saw a 6.5% target share, just 1.5 targets per game. Probably is not going to cut it for 18 receptions and just 8 receiving yards per game. So you have Gus Edwards, you have the lack of a receiving game role with Lamar Jackson back there. And if we just want to kind of dive in just right now on the screen just to see what Lamar Jackson has done the past 2 seasons on the ground, we know it's fantastic, but just as a refresher here, especially the big thing as it's bolded what he's doing in the red zone. 2020 led the league in attempts for quarterbacks at 10.6 per game, 159 attempts, over 1,000 yards with 1,005 and 7 touchdowns. He also had a whopping, and it wasn't even number 1, it was number 2, a whopping 32 red zone attempts. That's clearly going to take away from all the running backs. Also, the one who's going in the top 18 right now in J.K. Dobbins. 2019, he had the bigger years, MVP season, 1,200 total yards, 27 red zone attempts, led all running backs in all rushing categories. But he's going to see around 30 red zone attempts. He's going to keep running in the red zone. If he runs anywhere, right, the high upside, the high range, the ways where you can be a little bit more variant and get your offense to be deceptive is having your quarterback run in general, but especially in the red zone where it's higher stakes. You get a bigger payoff there with the touchdowns. There is a narrative to say Lamar can't keep running this many times per game. He can't keep running over 330 times over these 2-year spans. He's going to get clobbered. And that's true, but if he's taking away the red zone touches still, and that's where if you're going to limit it, you limit it to that, that'll hurt these running backs. And the top 18 one, J.K. Dobbins. Dobbins last year over the final 2 weeks of the season, Mark Ingram didn't play. And there was a lot of hype. Maybe he can command the backfield. And look, Dobbins over like the last 6 weeks was a top 25 running back each and every week. Touchdowns got him there in a couple of those weeks. His second to last week of the year, he had a 140-yard performance. I told you, he's highly efficient. The problem is, does the usage come with that to be a borderline top 15 running back that he's going at right now? My answer is no. And you didn't see it last year. Over the last 2 weeks of the season, Lamar Jackson's still involved, and they wanted to keep Gus Edwards still involved. And now, after paying him, I assume they want to continue to keep him still involved. Although he was highly efficient and averaged a great per-touch basis, that's something that regresses. You don't just stay insanely efficient, especially after a rookie campaign. This is not going to continue to happen. Just look at somebody like Austin Eckler, people thought would stay that efficient and remain an RB top 3 even after the injury. He wasn't that last year. So he saw less than 50% of the snaps in each of those last 2 weeks, and he only combined for 24 touches in 2 weeks. That's nowhere near workhorse. If he did it in 1 week, that's a workhorse. 24 total touches on 25 opportunities. Only 1 reception. Only 1 target. No receptions in those last 2 weeks. So receiving game wasn't there when there was no Mark Ingram, and it was the backfield that you're going to get this specific year. Justice Hill for 10 to 15% of the snaps. Gus Edwards for 40 to 50% of the snaps. And Lamar Jackson back there. He saw 12 touches per each of those 2 weeks. Eventually, he's going to stop averaging 6 yards per touch, right? And when it gets down to even 4.5, 5, which is quality, it's a big drop off and starts to put you outside of the top 20 range. Now, this is the best supporting cast Lamar Jackson in the passing game has arguably ever had in his entire football career. High school, obviously, these guys are way more talented, but even going back to college, definitely more talented now that you have all these guys coming together in the NFL. By far the best. Like last year, he was dealing with Miles Boykin, who was basically a tight end on the outside in terms of how slow and inability to separate or yards after the catch he was. He was a 0. Willie Snead, who was your average slot wide receiver with old age and a lot of injuries, wasn't getting separation, right? Not much there. Now you're replacing those guys with, okay, you got Sammy Watkins. He's somewhat of an upgrade from Willie Snead, maybe, right? Some explosiveness when healthy. But mainly, you go to the draft. Tylan Wallace, somebody who was underrated in the draft process, a rookie wide receiver. And oh yeah, Rashad Bateman, arguably the best wide receiver right there with Jamar Chase in this past draft. Still got Mark Andrews out there. He's going to be healthier. And let's not forget about Hollywood Brown, who's been seen as this X-wide receiver, the guy who's got to be the alpha downfield, when really, in all honesty, let's not kid ourselves, he's just a burner. He's just the Deshaun Jackson, the Marquez Valdez-Scantling of an offense. Go downfield. Not a guy who can deal with number one cornerbacks all year long, like Rashad Bateman is going to be tasked with this year. So the offense in the passing game should be more efficient in terms of having better weapons out there. You get more yards after the catch, like a Rashad Bateman. You get more separation and downfield usage on weaker cornerbacks. There is less of an overall rushing pie from a yardage standpoint, an attempt standpoint, and potentially a touchdown standpoint if, which has not been the case for 2 years now, the passing game can actually take a step forward this year. And to hit on the offensive line, that also is likely going to get worse. You trade away Orlando Brown, who was a big piece of the offensive line last year. Heading into last season, a Hall of Famer in Yonda retires. Midway through the season, Ronnie Stanley gets hit with an injury. They were the number 14 run blocking unit last year, overall being around number 10 last year, and PFF currently has them as the number 12 overall offensive line. They drafted a player in Ben Cleveland to see if he'll be able to fill a guard spot for them. They picked up Zeitler and Villanueva from their rival in the division, the Pittsburgh Steelers. So if anything, you can say this is a net neutral. I would say arguably it's slightly a little bit worse. Ronnie Stanley gets a year older coming off of injury. Slightly a little bit worse. If anything, very similar. But yeah, this is what you're looking at right now. There's a lot of concerns here. The passing game getting bigger. Gus Edwards, the investment in him, and him not just going, he's a big part of this offense. He's a 1A, 1B, not the backup running back in my opinion. And just what is the passing game usage going to be like if you want to put this guy as a borderline top 15, borderline RB1 right now? J.K. Dobbins, for me, a stay away in drafts at his current ADP. My RB24 in my ranks going as the RB17 right now. I'm never going to get him. I'm going to stay away from him, and I think you should as well. Thank you for tuning into this video today on a player that you should avoid, stay away from in your drafts. If you want to see the entire 2021 fantasy football draft guide, it's available, limited time offer for free. You can see how to get that down below on Prize Picks. They're sponsoring the program. Everything you need to dominate your draft, everything you need to get caught up to speed on who all these players and all these rookies are. It's going to be your best resource for you. You can find out how to get it right now for a lovely additional add-on bonus, a free bonus, thanks to our sponsors. You can check it out down below. Like and subscribe before you go. I appreciate you all in advance, and I'll see you all in the next one.